Alrighty, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ask the Expert with Dr. Lawrence Hirsch, which is the Director of Epilepsy of the Comprehensive Epilepsy Center, Professor of Neurology, and Chief of the Division of Epilepsy and EEG, all at Yale University. So some of his many interests and publications include brain stimulation for epilepsy, seizure clusters, status epilepticus, and brain monitoring of critical ill patients. He has lectured throughout the world and has published hundreds of articles. So I will now hand this over to Dr. Hirsch.
Great. Thank you. And thanks to those of you who joined, chose to. Oh, I need permission to share, Amy. There we go. Okay. That look right now?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So yeah, I'm happy. I think I can see if the chat pops up. But if not, maybe you can keep an eye on it and let me know if it's questions, because yeah, definitely if you have clarifying questions or anything the whole time, feel free to interrupt. I only probably have about 20, 25 minutes of prepared material, so happy to be interrupted. All right, so today's topic is seizure detection devices and home monitoring. The only disclosure that I have that's slightly relevant is I do speak and do training sessions for epilepsy fellows for NeuroPace, which I mostly talked about on a prior one, but I'll mention briefly at the end today. All right, so how do we diagnose different spells and how often people are having them? So this is, people often come to us with that question. Somebody's having seizures or spells that might be seizures, and we have to figure out what they are. So we record the brain waves with electroencephalography, more easily pronounced as EEG. So that's just to record your brain waves. The best is to have it during a spell, but that's not always possible. That's known as an ictal recording, means during a seizure. But usually we get them between spells, or known as interictal. And that can still show abnormalities in about 85% of people with epilepsy. Even when they're not having seizures, we will eventually see abnormal discharges called spikes or sharp waves on an EEG. It might take a few EEGs, it might take an overnight EEG, but again, about 85% of people, we will see those. So there's certainly people who have epilepsy and their EEGs are completely normal the rest of the time, other than the time they're having a seizure. So the first thing we usually start with is just what we call a routine EEG. That's where you sit in the lab and get somewhere between a 30 and 60-minute recording usually. You might look at something like this, and you get electrodes glued to the scalp, usually something about 20 electrodes on the head in different areas. And you're asked to open and close your eyes and maybe hyperventilate and get lights flashed at you and things like that. So that's what we start with. And then if we don't get a clear answer from that, sometimes we do a more prolonged recording. And these we usually, the next thing we would try is to do them at home. And there's two ways to do that. So that's known as ambulatory EEG or home EEG. And one way is to have the electrodes put on in the lab. So you come to the hospital or clinic, get the electrodes put on. Usually there's some kind of head wrap, and then you go home with it. And that can be with or without a video camera. That takes, then basically you have to come back to get disconnected as well. So it's 2 trips to the EEG lab for that one. this became much more popular in the pandemic. We started just doing home video EEG, where the tech will actually come into your house and put the leads on, usually with video also, and leave them on and then come back and disconnect. So you never have to leave the home at all. No driving. It's much easier. It usually involves a third-party company. Like, for example, we have a couple of companies that we contract with for that. We read the EEGs, but the companies send the text to the home and do the hookups. So that's home video EEG. And that has become very popular. Actually, is a pretty big advance because people who have trouble making 2 trips to a lab, they can still get recordings and good ones at home. Both of these are good for something like 1 to 3 days. You really can't keep the electrodes working well longer than that. And here's just some pictures of people wearing ambulatory EEGs. Usually there's some kind of pouch either wear over the shoulder, around the waist, or something that holds the recorder and some of the wires. And you can see the little video camera in one example here. Okay, so if we don't get an answer from that, the next thing we can do is the inpatient video EEG monitoring, which I'm not really going to talk about today since that's not the topic. But then when we do that, the big advantage is you're in a closely monitored setting and we can actually withdraw medications to make seizures happen faster. Here's just an example of someone in a bed getting video EEG monitoring. This is what goes on behind the scenes. So this is our control room taken with a very wide angle lens, so it looks much bigger than it actually is. But there's lots of people watching, lots of computers. I think I have a close-up. So here's an example of everybody getting the video and EEG monitors. They're continuously watched in another room as a safety measure. And also we have intercoms, so you can call in and start testing patients to see if they're awake and responsive as well. There's also computers on here running seizure detectors and alarms and fancy computer analysis going on. So that's what's going on behind the scenes, both for the people in the epilepsy monitoring unit and people in intensive care units getting their brains monitored with EEG. All right, so this is a long list of stuff, but this is kind of the meat of this topic, is detecting seizures at home. So there's 2 real purposes for that. One is to help diagnose spells to see if they're epilepsy or some other kind of spell. And then the other is for safety purposes. So somebody, most of these devices now, when they detect a seizure, will send an alert so somebody can come and make sure the patient is safe. And the other one is to count seizures. So it's actually a lot of people are not aware of all their seizures. In fact, most people are not aware of all their seizures, especially ones that happen during sleep. So it's more than 80% of them are not reported by the patient. When we bring people in the monitoring unit, we ask them to report all their seizures. The ones that happen in sleep, the vast majority never get reported. And even in the daytime, a large portion of the patient is not even aware that they happened. So this is another way of counting seizures, which is very useful for figuring out whether medicines are helping or any kind of treatment is helping, whether the patient is seizure free or not, and is also very useful in clinical trials for getting accurate numbers of seizures. And one of the big safety purposes is to pick up convulsions because they're dangerous in multiple ways. People fall, like can get physical injuries, including head injuries from that. And the biggest fear is what's known as sudden death in epilepsy, or SUDEP. And that's mostly related to uncontrolled convulsions, and particularly convulsions that happen in sleep. So most of these devices, fortunately, that's what they're best at picking up, are the convulsive seizures. And there is evidence that just having a person in the room or someone in the area can actually help prevent SUDEP, probably just either from stimulation or just positioning the patient. All right, so what are some of the devices? So the most common one are wearables, particularly wristwatch devices, and they mostly just pick up repetitive jerking of a limb. And there's a few of those. I'll have some specifics in the next few slides. There's also things you can put under your mattress that will just pick up abnormal movement. And I mentioned for all of these, I'll often give the name of a particular one. So MedPage is one of the more common one of those. Some people just use regular baby monitors and listen, and that can be effective, certainly for convulsions. There's often noise with them or even a vocalization at the beginning of a convulsion. People use video monitors that will basically just start recording when they detect motion. So one of the ones that's used for seizure detection is the SAMI monitor. It's actually designed as a sleep activity monitor. As you'll see, virtually all these devices are not specifically approved for detecting seizures. There's only one that is, and it's one of the watches. So this is a sleep activity monitor, but it will pick up seizures as well as other movements during sleep. There are other wearables that some of them are on the head that use actual EEG recordings. Some of them just pick up heart rate, whether that's worn on the chest or on the wrist. Some actually look at sweating and skin conductance. It's a measure of autonomic activity that tends to change with seizures. Some look at EMG, which is a measure of muscle contraction. So there was one device that was approved that you wore on your biceps during sleep and picked up convulsive activity based on the contractions there. But that one doesn't exist anymore. And then oxygen levels is another one that's often done just by a sensor worn on the finger. You can measure pulse rate and oxygen at the same time. That's commonly used in the hospital as a way of monitoring patients. Many of these devices will link with smartphones and they have apps with them. Some will use different combination of these methods. None of them are perfect for detecting seizures, but they are pretty good at picking up convulsions, particularly when people are supposed to be sleeping. So any rhythmic limb activity while you're sleeping is very likely to be a seizure, as opposed to when people are awake, you get much more false positives. Like if you're wearing it on your wrist in the hand where you're brushing your teeth, it almost always goes off as if you're having a seizure. So people learn not to brush with that hand or just not to have the watch on at that time. And most of them do have a way to cancel before it calls somebody for help, that gives you a time to cancel it. So if you're fully awake and not having a seizure, you can just cancel the alert. There are a bunch of publications on how well these devices work. They're mostly based on people in the hospital, in the epilepsy monitoring unit, getting recorded to see, so that we have a definitive answer on when there's a seizure and when there's not. And they're pretty darn good, again, for the convulsions. Unfortunately, they're not yet good for most of the other seizure types, like just the staring spells. It used to be called complex partial seizures. Now they're called focal impaired aware seizures. These devices so far are not great at picking those up. Sometimes it can pick them up, mostly with a sudden increase in heart rate. But there's a lot of false positives with those so far. None of these have been proven to decrease the sudden death in epilepsy. Fortunately, that's rare enough that it's very hard to study. You need very large number of patients wearing these devices and then a group you can compare to. But nonetheless, we think it's likely that it can indeed prevent this. And then it's not a device, but seizure dogs are another thing that people use as a seizure detector or seizure alarm. And you can train dogs to react to seizures. That actually works very well. There's some safety measures with that too, and they can be trained to set off alerts, whether it's just barking or if it's actually doing something a little fancier than that. Let me see. There's
Dr.
some. You
Hirsch?
have some questions? Yeah.
Yes. The first one is, does EEG pick up motor movements that are not registering as seizures, such as myoclonic jerks?
EEG can show abnormalities during myoclonic jerks if they're epileptic myoclonic jerks. There's actually some that are not. EEG is normal during them. But these devices will not pick up single jerks. I hope that answered that question.
The second one is more of a statement. I have a SAMI monitor, but it's very difficult to connect to home internet.
I don't know what to say about that one. Yeah, a lot of these do take, well, they almost all take, you have to have some internet connection for the alerts to work. Hopefully the companies will be able to provide assistance with that. Yeah, that's kind of prerequisite for almost all of these, that you have some internet. Any other?
Nope, no more for now.
Okay. All right. So now I'll show you the only device that actually is FDA cleared as a seizure detector, and that's the Empatica device. It's actually now called the Epi Monitor. It used to be the Embrace Watch. Now it's the Epi Monitor system, but it includes the, it basically is the Embrace Watch plus the app it comes with. So this is FDA cleared for ages 6 and up. And the pictures I have here are completely from the company website. So it's obvious this is advertising, but they do say it's the only FDA cleared wrist-worn wearable for epilepsy monitoring in the US. Yeah, so this thing is very good at picking up convulsions. It's easy to wear. It's on basically the 3rd generation now. It has nice things like you can set the sensing precision. So you see an example here, it's set at high, but if it's going off too often, it's too sensitive, you can lower it. It lets you send messages to different numbers of caregivers depending on what kind of subscription you have. It has an up to 7-day battery life without recharging. It does have that nice feature of where you can cancel alarms. It first gives you a chance to say you're okay, and if you say you are, then it doesn't alert anybody, but otherwise it will. I mentioned that already. And the app has a lot of nice things. It gives you trends of seizures and keeps track of them. It's got a diary. It also can be used as like a Fitbit. It keeps track of your sleep and activity, although you have to pay more for that feature. It's more in the subscription. And your diary can be exported into a format that you can email, upload, or print as a PDF for your doctor or for whoever you want to share it with. And I did just look good on the web to see what it costs nowadays. So the device itself is $350. Sometimes insurance will cover it. Plus, there's then a subscription. And this is the amounts. There's the basic plan, standard, and the plus. And the difference is largely the number of caregivers you want alerted. Not sure why you want 10 people alerted, but hopefully 3 is enough. But also this includes whether you wanted some of those Fitbit-like features. I think you have to pay more for that. There's actually many more rows here that I didn't include in the slide. Yeah, so you get an idea of what it costs. So it's certainly not free. Again, sometimes insurance will pay, although I'm not sure they've ever paid for the subscription part, but for getting the original device, it does sometimes pay. In addition, there's at least 2 foundations that will, actually maybe 3, counting the Epilepsy Foundation, that might provide financial assistance. So the Danny Did Foundation has a nice website about devices, and that includes some financial assistance with an application. And there's also the Chelsea Hutchison Foundation, which provides funding for either seizure dogs or seizure detection devices. So here's some of the names and links. And other information, there's a couple other websites listed here for other information about seizure alerts and devices, including the Epilepsy Foundation. Healthline has a nice comparison of all the devices and apps, although it's oddly missing Empatica, the only one that's FDA approved. So not sure how that happened. And the other thing to know is if you already have an Apple Watch or a similar smartwatch, there are a bunch of apps designed for seizure detection. Again, none of them are as proven and none of them are FDA approved, but they probably work reasonably well. If people have tried them, please let me know. But you'll see that the wording on their marketing will say things like detect seizure-like activity or arrhythmic jerking because they can't say it's a seizure detector. And also will pick up either a sudden increase in heart rate or drop in heart rate. This is the Seize Alarm version. And they also have self-triggering things. So if you feel an aura, you can, there's a nice feature that has, if you feel an aura, you can click it as send an alert, but you can also do it with a time delay. So if it just goes away, you can then cancel it and won't have alerted anybody. But if you don't then cancel it, it will send an alert to somebody to get help. And then another one that's fairly commonly used is this smart monitor. It's called Inspire with a Y. So those are some of the more common apps. I see there are some questions. One is okay. This is a tough question. Are there dogs that can detect a seizure before it happens? So that's hotly debated. Most of the time they're reacting to a seizure that has already started. There are certainly some dogs, anecdotally, I've definitely heard about these. And that's an attempt at, when seizure dogs are trained, is an attempt to have them have these tells that can be recognized. That has really not been well proven that they can detect them or predict seizures. But I think they're very good at picking up changes in behavior and even changes in expression or mood in the very early stages of seizures. Having said that, there is reason to think it could. We're actually doing some research at Yale on different odors or different volatile molecules that are released before seizures. And there are some things that change well before a seizure actually starts. So there is some physiologic rationale to think that dogs might be able to detect that. So the answer is kind of maybe. Which ring devices sensor movement alert would you recommend one model for ring? I've never seen any of the rings studied for seizures yet. If they have, I have not, hasn't made it to major publications. I assume you mean like a regular jewelry kind of ring, because that's the latest thing for, instead of watches, to just do as a ring as a way of doing physiologic monitoring. So yeah, I haven't seen any real data on ring devices. So I have nothing to share for you on that. If you do, let me know. All right, just a few more things. So there are some other ways of, most of the EEG things I talked about are just for a few days. There are some long-term home monitoring methods coming about. None of these are approved yet, at least on this slide. So one, for example, that we're hoping to study is this from a company called Epitel. These are little stick-ons. You can put up to 4 of them on, it's either on the forehead or behind the ear. And they actually have all fancy little, it's like a little EEG amplifier inside each one. And it can record up to 30 days, and they have artificial intelligence-based detection of seizures. So we'll see on that one. That's the other thing with all of these is it's so much data that they have to provide some kind of computer reading of the EEG, or at least computer marking of segments that could be of importance. So there's a lot of artificial intelligence and machine learning for EEG reading. A lot of research going on into that. The next kind of phase of this is there's several different subcutaneous, or what's called subscalp electrodes. These are put in as a minor surgical procedure where they're put under the skin, outside the skull, but under the skin. And you can get months of monitoring for this. And at least one of them is approved in Europe, but none in the US yet. So I have some schematics of these. So these are 6 different versions of these. They're all subscalp, so they're under the skin, implanted. And then they talk to a device that's external, either something that's directly over it. So here's one, it's kind of like a cochlear implant. You wear it on the ear, but it actually talks to the one that is under the skin where the EEG recordings are happening. And there's a bunch of versions of these, and whether they record from one side or this one passes over to the other side, a little bit of a bigger procedure. And they all have to be recharged with this external devices. And they usually have some separate piece. You either wear it immediately over it, or you wear in the chest wall, or carry something around where that will be the recorder. We can see they're all just different variations on that. I think here's just a closer up version of what they look like. So these are coming out. They're really so far just being studied in the US, but I think we will have them. And these are great for really long term, like many months of recording. And it helps to know exactly where someone's seizures come from for this, so you know which site to put it on or which exact spot. So that's the subcutaneous one. And then the ultimate best long-term recorder of EEG is the intracranial EEG through the responsive neurostimulator. This is one I talked about in a prior session on neurostimulation or neuromodulation. So this is the device. It's completely implanted. Everything's under the skin. So the actual device itself with the battery and the stimulator replaces a piece of the skull, and the electrodes go in the brain or on the surface of the brain, and it records your brain continuously. You program it to detect abnormal activity, and it keeps data for months or years. And this has turned out to be very useful as a recording device. So people with seizures from like both temporal lobes, for example, it will figure out if you really come from both, or if when you're on full meds going about your normal life, they only come from one side. And that's enabled us to actually do curative surgery on a reasonable number of patients based on these long-term recordings. It can count seizures very precisely. Again, people usually can't do that themselves too well. It's very common for us not to be sure whether something is a seizure or not. Somebody might wake up just not feeling quite right, or they might have had a spell where they're suddenly anxious. They're not sure if it's a seizure or not. Things like that we can completely answer with these kind of implanted intracranial devices. It's also enabled us, because of having these like years of data measuring seizures and abnormal activity, we learn all kinds of long-term patterns. We've always known there's a 24-hour cycle, like people will have all their seizures at night or all their seizures at a certain time of day. It varies from person to person, but it's pretty stable within a person. But it turns out there's these very long patterns too, where people do that every 3 weeks or every 4 weeks. And that's in men too, not just women, and it's not just related to menstrual cycle. In fact, we don't know what it's from, but they're pretty strong cycles. And it's picked up some other patterns too. And it's also let us realize that there's a change in the EEG well before a seizure happens in many patients. And you can use that to help predict their seizures. We've also seen that when you try a new treatment, like a new medication, the recordings can tell you within a week or two whether that drug is going to work or not. You don't have to wait the weeks to months of trying it to see if it's going to work. And with some patients, we've been able to use this as provide patients with a seizure warning system. Because not only does it record, but it also enables you to stimulate, often in a way where you can make the patient feel it so it can act as a warning to them. That's just something about the chronic intracranial recording. So now we're moving more towards not inside the skull like this, but more of the outside the skull under the skin. And I showed you one that was even just a stick on the skin. And then related to this is the term that's become not seizure prediction, but seizure forecasting. So it's much more like the weather. Like you say, you know, there's an 80% chance of rain today or 20%. There have been efforts using primarily the long-term intracranial recordings of the invasive ones from the responsive neurostimulation system. But using fancy computer analysis and these very long-term recordings, they've shown that this actually shows what the forecasted probability of a seizure was. So whether it's the 20% chance of a seizure that day or a 40% chance, and then what the actual rate of seizures was in those people when they had that level of forecast. And it was very accurate. So when it said it was a 40% chance, about 40% of the time they went on to have a seizure. Very, very few people get to the 80% or 100%. So it's not as accurate up there. But when you're down in the 20 to 40%, it was remarkably accurate. So it can't say for sure, but it can give you a pretty accurate probability, just like a weather forecast. So this is coming. There's actually a big research project funded by the Epilepsy Foundation called My Seizure Gauge, where they're trying to do this with non-invasive wearables, apps, heart rate, mood, diaries, looking at these long-term cycles and figuring out the best way to forecast seizures. Some of these people do have recordings under the skin or even the RNS invasive version, and that's a way of telling the actual rate. But the goal is to see if seizures can be forecast with these non-invasive or minimally invasive methods. And it's actually looking fairly promising. Might not work in everybody, but it looks like in a lot of people, it is going to work. So you'll be hearing more about that. So conclusions, home short-term monitoring is now standard. So these 1 to 3 days at home. There's one FDA cleared device for detecting convulsive seizures at home. That's the Empatica watch. And there's multiple others that work, but aren't as proven and aren't FDA cleared. But these are very useful for people who have incompletely controlled convulsions, particularly nighttime ones or ones in their sleep. There's many other devices being tested or developed, including systems that will record for weeks or months or even years. Some of them are invasive, some are minimally invasive, just under the skin. We're starting to see some that are just stick-on that you can take on and off as you need to. Again, most of these are not approved yet, but they're well into the testing phases. And seizure forecasting is coming soon. I think that's all I have. Here's a picture of our epilepsy center staff and researchers. And I'm happy to take more questions.
Right, we have one. It says, I meant to say the company that makes ring security cameras. Do those cameras work?
I'm not sure. There's certainly cameras that just pick up motion and then will record, but whether they can identify seizures versus other movements, not as clear, but you can certainly set them to send an alert whenever there's excessive movement or movement that lasts more than a certain number of seconds. But I don't know about the ring security in particular. Yeah, if other people have tried devices or have experience, please let me know. That's the only way we learn what things are working and what things are not, or how user-friendly they are. Or you can ask me anything while you have me.
Anyone have any questions or concerns regarding the presentation today?
All right, well, it's still daylight out. Go if you haven't already, go outside and enjoy the weather.
That's right. Oh, wait, we have one. Is there a way to get a summary of devices?
Yeah, so I put some of the websites here that have that. So these are probably your best bet. Yeah, Danny did usually keeps it up. So they have a list of the devices. Danny did Foundation. Yeah, epilepsy.com has it. Chelsea Foundation is more, actually has a lot about dogs if you want to hear about dogs. Yeah, so those are probably, first one had nice formatting things, but again was missing some of the main players. So, yeah, these were the best ones I could find.
Annabella says thank you.
My pleasure.
And it looks like that's all the questions so far.
Give it a few more seconds.
Yes.
All right.
All right, thank you, Dr. Hirsch, for today's presentation. This presentation will also be recorded and put on our website. So if anyone is interested and wants to go back to refer back to anything, you're welcome to go on our website, epilepsyct.com, and it will be under our Ask the Expert series. And we have a thank you from Neil. All righty. Well, thank you everyone for participating today. Thank you, Dr.
All right.
Hirsch.
Thanks, everyone. Yep. Bye-bye.
Mm.